What if I told you that insults only hurt you because you give them permission? You see, the great Stoic philosophers, men like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, they had a mental rule that made them immune to the cruelest of words, the sharpest of criticisms, and even the most vicious of attacks. And in this video, I'm going to teach you that rule. And along the way, I'm going to show you how to apply it to your own life so that you too can become untouchable. But before we get into that, let me just say that I didn't come up with this idea on my own. It comes from one of my favorite books, The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. So make sure you check that book out when you're done with this video. Now, if you don't know, Stoicism was a philosophy built for these exact moments, for when things aren't going your way, for when people are acting like jerks, for when life is trying to knock you down. It was developed 2,000 years ago by Zeno of Citium, who was born poor, enslaved, and eventually lost everything he owned in a shipwreck. But despite all those obstacles, he built one of the most influential philosophies of all time. And it survived for two reasons. One, because it was written down by its most famous students, including Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. And two, because its teachings have real-world applications that anyone can use. In particular, we're going to focus on one teaching today, the Stoic Rule that makes you immune to insults. Now, back to the story. You see, when Stoicism was developed, insults were everywhere. Everyone debated in public, everyone ridiculed each other, and every political attack was a personal attack. So learning how to deal with insults wasn't an option for the Stoics. It was a necessity. And here's what they discovered. The words themselves didn't hurt you. It was your judgment of those words that caused all the pain. In fact, Seneca said that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone yells at you, "Hey, you're such a weakling. You couldn't handle yourself in a fight." Now, that sounds pretty terrible, right? But think about it. The word weak doesn't actually do anything to you. It's just a word. The pain comes from either agreeing with it, which means that you believe you're actually weak, or disagreeing with it, which means that you're afraid of being weak. But either way, you're giving the insult more power than it actually has. So here's the Stoic rule to help you handle any insult, and it's super simple. Just remember, if someone speaks ill of you, remember that it is their opinion. In other words, separate opinion from fact. See? The Stoics believed that words were simply opinions and not truths, so they couldn't actually touch you unless you let them. Marcus Aurelius put it perfectly. He said, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't be harmed." There's a lot of ways to practice this rule, but I found 4 different techniques that all Stoics use to become masters of dealing with insults. So let's start with no. 1. Indifference. The first Stoic response to an insult is to be indifferent to it. Okay. To be indifferent doesn't mean that you don't care or that you agree with the insult. It just means that you recognize it for what it is, an opinion that has no bearing on your virtue or your character. In fact, Marcus Aurelius wrote, "He who is not annoyed by trifles leads a tranquil life." So the key is to practice known resistance. to become like a stone in a river, hard and unmoving, where the water may flow around it, but it cannot change its nature. One perfect example of this comes from the life of Cato the Younger. One day, while he was walking through the Roman Forum, some young nobles started making fun of him. They said things like, "Hey, old man, why don't you take a break? You're working too hard." But Cato just smiled and continued on his way. He didn't even bother arguing with them because he knew that their opinion meant nothing. No, 2. The reverse test. This next practice was taught by Seneca, and it's one of my favorites. All you have to do is ask yourself one question, okay? Is it true now, when someone insults you, it's natural to feel a little bit hurt? So, take a deep breath, remain calm, and ask yourself, is this true? If the answer is yes, then you should thank them for pointing it out. After all, now you know what you need to work on. But if the answer is no, then it's easy to ignore the insult. Why be upset by something that isn't true? For example, let's say someone calls you lazy. If it's true, then you need to adjust your habits. But if it's not true, then you shouldn't worry about it at all. No. 3. Own it. This is one of my favorite stories because it shows the power of owning an insult. One day, Cato the Younger was walking through the streets of Rome when he heard someone yell, "Hey, there goes the bald-headed philosopher." Now, you might think that Cato was upset by this, but he wasn't. He didn't try to argue with the man or prove that he was wrong. Instead, Cato simply smiled and replied, "Better bald than wear a wig." In other words, he took the insult, turned it on its head, and laughed at it. So how can you practice this in your own life? Well, Epictetus suggested that we should be content to be thought foolish. In other words, when someone calls you names, when they call you weird or strange or awkward, you should laugh it off and make light of the situation. When you accept the label, it loses its sting. No. 4. Think bigger. The Stoics always zoomed out. They would ask themselves, will this matter in a day, a year, or after I die? If the answer was no, then they wouldn't worry about it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. Everything we think we know is a belief, not a reality." So when someone insults you, remind yourself that it's just an opinion. It's not the truth, and it doesn't change who you are. In fact, an insult is nothing but dust in time. So don't blow it out of proportion. So what changes? You see, living by the Stoic Rule is kind of like training a muscle. At first, it's hard, but over time, it gets easier. And the benefits are enormous. For starters, you stop giving control of your emotions to other people. Remember, your mood should be dictated by your own thoughts, not the words of random strangers. Secondly, you become calm and steady, and you don't get rattled by the little things. Thirdly, you become untouchable. Your enemies can't hurt you anymore because their weapons are blunt. And fourthly, your friends will respect you more because you don't play into the gossip or the rumors. And that last part is important because it's natural to want to defend ourselves when we re-attacked. But if you keep getting drawn into arguments and debates and petty fights, you're still giving the insult power over you. Now, here's the best part. The Stoics were able to use this rule in every area of their life, from politics to relationships to business and everything in between. In other words, it's not just a feel-good philosophy, it's practical wisdom for everyday problems. Today, social media is full of trolls and keyboard warriors, people who are experts at delivering cruel and hurtful messages. But by following the Stoic rule, you can protect yourself from their poisonous words. When you're able to remain indifferent, when you're able to reverse the test and ask yourself if it's true, when you're able to own your mistakes and laugh at your weaknesses, and when you're able to zoom out and think bigger than the social media, trolls lose their power over you. You become free to use social media for what it was intended for, to connect with others and to share ideas. It also applies to the workplace. Gossip is everywhere. In fact, the word gossip comes from the Italian word gossipo, which means to savor. People love to savor the taste of juicy rumors and scandalous stories. But by following the Stoic rule, you can stay above the fray. You can remain focused on your work without getting distracted by office politics and petty arguments. And finally, it applies to family. Criticism from loved ones can be especially painful, but by following the Stoic rule, you can turn it into a source of growth. When your family members criticize you, ask yourself, is it true? If the answer is yes, then adjust and improve. If the answer is no, then let it go. By practicing this mental rule, you will become better at handling any insult, any criticism, and any attack. In fact, it's quite possible that you could become the most resilient person in any room. And that's why I think that this Stoic rule is so powerful. So make sure you write this down, memorize it, and practice it every single day until it becomes second nature. And if you do, I promise you'll be unstoppable. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure you subscribe. And if you want to learn more about Stoicism, I recommend you start with this video right here.